Now, moving quite a bit on to geology, so obviously geology and chemistry are a little bit further removed from each other. And geology was really amazing because actually it took a really long time for people to come up with the idea that maybe the Earth didn't always look the way that it does now. And that seems like a pretty obvious realization to us, but it wasn't until 1681 when someone else suggested this, and this was Thomas Burnet, and he wrote The Sacred Theory of the Earth. And he said, maybe the Earth used to look one way and it has slowly changed over time. And this was something that's a bit of a departure maybe from some of the biblical concepts of the Earth being created, and then we have now what God created back then. And once people began to think, hey, maybe there has been some change, then they started to realize that actually some of the changes that might have happened couldn't really happen over the time scale that's presented in the Bible. And so this made people start to question actually what was happening in the physical environment and whether it meshed with our religious ideas. So really important researchers in this time included Benoit de Maillet and Le Comte de Buffon, and these guys were the ones who were really responsible for arguing against the biblical timescale. And it was also during this time that we have researchers developing geological mapping techniques and classification schemes of rocks and minerals, and this allows them to date geological layers. And for instance, you also have in the 19th century Louis Agassiz, who discussed the importance of ice ages and the concept that actually previous to now we have very cold periods of time where a lot of the moisture on the Earth was kept up in ice, and these ice masses would sit on top of the land, and this would weigh down the land, and it would also, as the ice moved across the land, flatten things out and move things from one place to another. And this began, understandably, to really change our idea of what the landscape was like and how it was shaped. It kind of related to that, you have Andrew Cromby Ramsey in the 19th century also, who proposed that valleys didn't just appear as they were, but actually maybe they formed because rivers kept running through the land in the same track, and over by wearing down they might eventually have formed valleys. And of course today we do know that this is true, but even just in the 19th century, which is not really that long ago when you think about how long we've been around thinking about science, people were still thinking that actually these valleys were just always the way that they are now. And of course all of this is important, accumulating into the theory of continental drift, which was proposed by Alfred Wegener in the early 20th century. But what's kind of funny is that this was a very good idea that we now recognize today as being pretty well unassailable, but he was ignored for quite a long time. And it took several decades for people to amass enough data kind of related to this topic for them to realize that yes, actually there is quite a lot of support for the idea of plate tectonics, and plate tectonics could explain how drift could occur. Now finally we'll end up with the field that's nearest and dearest to my heart, and that's biology. And to start with, a lot of the biological developments that we see in this kind of modern era were extremely important for medicine. So for instance, we've got the Hungarian physician Semmelweis, who realized that hand washing prior to the delivery of children could help improve the health of mothers and prevent infection. And related to that, you've got Joseph Lister in 1865, who proved the principles of antisepsis. And all this was based on the findings of Louis Pasteur, who's the one who linked microorganisms with disease and produced a vaccine against rabies, and of course invented the process of pasteurization. So all this was quite important for understanding that there are microorganisms, bacteria and viruses that were responsible for making us ill, and for better understanding medical methods of combating those things. And of course, you can't not mention Darwin and Wallace, who developed the theory of evolution, and Darwin in particular, who developed the idea that evolution proceeded by natural selection. And he wrote On the Origin of Species in 1859. And this, of course, impacted research in nearly all areas of biology, because it helped provide both context and mechanism. And the very last thing I want to touch on is the idea that all of this was actually what came together to make kind of the last field to emerge, the last major field that's not a sub-discipline of one of these others. And that is ecology. And ecology didn't really emerge until the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And this happened because you have researchers who are joining concepts from Darwin, who talked, as I said, about evolution, and Alexander von Humboldt, who talked about biogeography. So you have people realizing that you've got species living in environments, and you've got environments that are shaped by geography and shaped by weather and all sorts of things, and that actually all of these things are related because species will follow certain environments and certain environments attract different types of species. And we actually have the word ecology being coined by Ernest Haeckel during this time, and he's the person who discovered and described thousands. I mean, it's amazing to think that there was a time when there were thousands of species that you could just go out and find with not too much difficulty. So he described all these thousands of animals and plants, and he also created a genealogical tree that related all life forms. And much of the research in this discipline became, in the 20th century, something that was closely related to conservation work and environmental efforts, because ecology kind of summarizes the lie of the land and what needs to be done to kind of keep things going in the best way possible. So whether or not you want to revert to some kind of natural thing is kind of contestable, but certainly we see how the ecosystems function and how they process, and we can then apply those ecological observations to management techniques to try to figure out how to keep all of those functions and processes flowing. Now, as I said, we did have this shift from everything kind of being the natural philosophy where it's all joined into one, and then it kind of broke up so that people went into specific disciplines. So you would go very narrowly, you would just focus on chemistry maybe, but then you would look at that in great depth. Well, now what's quite interesting is we're kind of cycling back around to that original Greek idea of natural philosophy in some respect, because we have this emphasis on being integrated and multidisciplinary. And so here we are trying to link up with these other fields. And this is very much like Aristotle and Ben Franklin, and I think these guys would be quite proud at the way that we've realized how all of these things are very much connected. And they're connected not just to each other in science, but also to lots of the other ideas that we have in daily life and in society and in politics. And they certainly are influenced by these things and also, in turn, influence them. And I hope that that is something that you can appreciate now after having heard my incredibly brief and very rushed history of Western science. And I think that I will end today on one last song that kind of broadly summarizes all of what I've been talking about, and that is Coldplay singing The Scientist. And with that, I will sign off and say I'll talk to you next week, and hopefully you'll let me know if you have any ideas about what my topic should be. Otherwise, it could be anything, who knows. All right, talk to you then.